Our next presenter is Bengt Miller, who's going to talk about knotweed control in the Upper Skagit Watershed. Bengt is currently the Stewardship Coordinator with the Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group, who he's worked with since 2010 doing all manner of salmon restoration work, from riparian enhancements to instream projects to monitoring and education and outreach. He strives to continually learn about restoration while constantly being amazed by the wonder of the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you so much for that intro. I appreciate it a ton. I'm going to keep my video off because I was having bandwidth issues earlier and getting booted out. So hopefully that will not be the case during this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about a large-scale knotweed control project in the Skagit Watershed that I managed for the Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group. The program was created by the created by the Nature Conservancy in the early 2000s in response to the Chinook recovery plan, which was put in place. And in that, it listed invasive species as a limiting factor affecting juvenile Chinook production. So the theory was if you can get rid of some of the invasive species, specifically some of the more threatening ones, you will increase Chinook production. The program, when it was initiated by the Nature Conservancy, decided to take a top-down watershed approach in a landscape scale. Instead of just being not just about the watershed, it was a much more targeted approach and sort of use the physiology of knotweed as one of the driving forces in its control. I'm not going to get much into, the threat knotweed poses. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but it is a plant that spreads largely vegetatively, and because it's a riparian plant, that means generally in flood that spreads from upstream patches downstream by plant fragmentation, either of the plant itself or the rhizomes underground. Any sort of control effort needs to address the uppermost patches of the watershed first. And the thought was at the time, if you start in the upper watershed and you just eventually eliminate those patches, work your way downstream, treating as you go, and eventually you will have eliminated the plant from the watershed. This sounds great in theory. So the Skagit CWMA, which is a cooperative weed management area, which is sort of a gathering of organizations, entities, municipalities concerned about knotweed in the Skagit watershed, decided to take a sub-watershed tiered management approach, meaning the larger Skagit watershed was broken up into sub-watersheds. And then each of those sub-watersheds was given a classification of either, clean, which meant there was no knotweed present, eradication, which meant theoretically knotweed could be gotten rid of from that watershed, and management, which meant knotweed was present within that watershed, and eradication is the end goal, but it seems unlikely in that sub-watershed due to any number of factors. In the early days when the Nature Conservancy had the program, it was sort of a scattershot approach. They would find some source of funding. They would hire a WCC crew seasonally during the summers, generally in the short term for whatever funding they had. And they would go out into these, following this tiered watershed top-down approach and try to treat knotweed. The initial thought was we'll see some knotweed, we'll treat it, we'll move on, and we'll get the whole watershed that way. Initially, the documentation was sort of inconsistent and sporadic because there was not a lot of thought given to repeating the process in subsequent years. Data management back in the original days was what was required to report herbicide treatments to the agencies, either funding the work or, WSDA or DOE for any herbicide application close to water. As the program continued, the methods and the processes evolved to the point where more metrics started being recorded so that progress could be shown over time. Things like stem counts, area measurements of patches, and then it'll eventually evolve to like identifying each individual patch of knotweed, hanging, flagging so that it could be found in subsequent years, taking a GPS point on it, going back to that patch year after year to monitor it and treat it if necessary. And then the program made a huge leap forward in pretty early on when one of the people working for the program was just at a bar in Skagit talking to someone sitting next to them at the bar stool. And they're like, "What do you do?" And they started describing the program, and that person was like, "Well, I'm a raft guide, and I totally support what you guys are doing. I think this plant is a huge pest in the watershed. I think it would be great to get you all out on a raft and we can do some treatments from the water." And from then on, that has been one of the main modes of transportation and treatment. So, early on, the program has evolved and progress was being made. In 2010, Skagit Fisheries inherited the Knotweed program from the Nature Conservancy. I believe they sort of shifted their focus more from upriver Skagit stuff to estuarian areas, and they were looking to offload the program, was looking for a place to home it. And Skagit Fisheries ended up being a wonderful place for that, because at the same time as that was happening with the Nature Conservancy, Scalise Light decided that they owned enough property in the Skagit that they wanted somebody to sort of steward and keep track of that land on the ground. And they came to Skagit Fisheries, and we were like, we have the local knowledge to be able to do that with them. So Skagit Fisheries is able to create this position within our organization that works on knotweed roughly half the time and on SCL conservation properties the other half the time. We've been fortunate to be able to continue running the program continually since 2010. As you can see by the number of on the ground field days on the years, the level of effort has fluctuated a bunch. Almost all this is dictated by available funding. I know it would be great to have one source of funding that we could go back to consistently, but that has not been the case. We are always seeking opportunities and grant funds to do this knotweed control work in the watershed. And I will touch on that a little bit later. And then 2011 also marked a huge turning point in the program. The Sauk-Suiattle tribe, which had been participating in the cooperative weed management area meetings, decided to initiate some on-the-ground control work. They sort of started a little bit smaller, working and taking over some of the watershed from Skagit Fisheries and working in the sort of the lower Sauk section. And it's been a wonderful partnership and cooperation with that tribe since then. And as our program has struggled to find funding, they have managed to continue to thrive and have expanded their treatment area and now fill in the gaps if there are certain parts of the watershed that Skagit Fisheries is not able to get to. So kudos to the Sauk-Suiattle tribe and partnership and coordination and working together. And I will touch on that more a little bit later. By 2017, we decided that we'd seen a large enough decline in knotweed in the Upper Skagit watershed that we decided to see if we could gather the resources and expand the program area downstream, because the overall lifetime goal is to get the whole watershed covered. And we had been working in just the upper parts above the confluence in Rockport since the program initiated. So we decided to see if we could, what kind of resources, and do an assessment on the feasibility of expanding that treatment area downstream. We were fortunate enough to get a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Pulling Together initiative that allowed us to do this. We decided that the easiest way to do an assessment would be to raft that section of river with a couple of handheld GPSs and just take points wherever we saw a knotweed along the riverbank. We were able to do this in 2 trips, one with an Earth Corps crew from Seattle who came up, and one with a couple of volunteers from Phillips 66, since it was their funding that they had contributed to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The initial thought was that we would be able to, so the original project area is outlined in red here. It's sort of upstream from Rockport up to Skagit and Sauk. Our initial thought was that we would expand 21 miles downstream to tie in with some work that Skagit County had been doing along Grandy Creek for a number of years at this point. It would kind of make a nice, tidy package. And it would continue to follow that sort of top-down approach and the sub-watershed method, which we had been following all along. If we did move to that confluence, it would include 6 sub-watersheds and 21 main stem miles of river. Well, after those reconnaissance rafting float trips, we realized the scale of the infestation was immense, which we sort of anticipated. I just don't think we knew how large it actually was. Because in those 2 raft trips, we GPSed over 1,000 knotweed patches, varying in size from football fields down to like 1 or 2 stems. And that was all from the rafts. It didn't include surveys like into the floodplain at all, into the upland areas, up any small tributaries or anything. So when we brought this information to the annual CWMA meeting, it was, and there's just a heat map where all those infestations are. When we brought this to the CWMA, it was decided that maybe we were a little overly ambitious and to scale back our intentions a little bit and bite off something much more manageable that we could actually commit resources to and it would have the capacity to deal with. So we decided to just expand 10 miles downstream, which got us, 1 sub-watershed and another length of the Skagit River. That seems to have been the right decision because we are able to do treatments in that middle Skagit reach is what, it's still far up the Skagit, but we call it the middle Skagit reach. So we're able to still do treatments in there and do the upper watershed. So we have not taken resources away from the upper watershed where knotweed is still present. At the same time that we decided to do this expansion, we worked with the Skagit CWMA to see if we wanted to reclassify any of these sub-watersheds in the basin based on now 8, 9, 10 years of experience. Based on people's backgrounds and knowledge, we decided that we could reclassify all the sub-basins that you see outlined here in pink. A lot of the ones in the upper Skagit control had gone better than expected, so we reclassified those from managed knotweed to eventual eradication. And we're making great headway towards that. We know where all the infestations are at this point, and now we're just trying to treat them to get rid of them. There was sort of a little backstep in the upper Sauk reaches. Because much of that is public land, I think the Skagit CWMA had initially decided that we could eradicate knotweed from those watersheds because we had access to it all and we would just go out there and treat it when we found it. Unfortunately, while it is public, the upper Sauk watershed is a very dynamic rate, but that river is in a different place every year and it spreads throughout the floodplain and just spreads knotweed everywhere. Change that classification to manage from eradicate, even though we are still able to go out there and do treatments. At this point, eradication just seems, maybe that's the extra long-term goal, but for the time being, we just want to manage it in that upper Sauk area and prevent it from spreading further downstream and infesting areas where we are also doing treatment. So let's get into sort of how the on-the-ground actual survey works. What we do before the season starts is assemble all the known knotweed points from all the years gone by, and at this point it is probably about 3,000 points, give or take. We overlay those over an aerial photo and go out and try to find as many of those points as we can from the past, especially the ones that were treated last year, because that's where our monitoring and efficacy data comes from. So we take out the field maps, the crew, and go out to a site and, hopefully it's what it looks like in the photo. A lot of times that is not the case, especially on the Sauk, as you can see in this photo. In the aerial photo, the river is, kind of in the upper right corner of the picture. When we went out to the actual site, the river had avulsed and was now flowing through the woods, which meant we had to adaptively manage our plan for the day and our overall access to the site. But that is par for the course, and anyone that does enough field work knows that these are just situations you deal with. I'm fairly old school and kind of a Luddite, so I still prefer the notebook, pen and pencil approach. I realize the world is moving forward digitally, so we have started to integrate some digital data collection into the Knotweed program. At this point, I don't trust it fully, probably more user error than the actual digital stuff itself. But at this point, we are collecting at pen and paper old school and digitally because there has been some inconsistencies between the digital data and the pen and paper method. So once those get ironed out, I think we will move more towards this digital data collection. We use, our, I guess it's field maps at this point for a lot of the mapping stuff that you can see. It's great to try to, navigate to pre-existing knotweed points. And for the database management, we use a program called iForm, which was recommended by the Washington State Department of Ag, because that's what they use, and it integrates well with a lot of different data management software. Once you have all the equipment assembled that you need, we take it out into the field, and generally we're away from the truck for the majority of the day, just walking around the floodplain as much as we can, and up tributaries and side channels and back eddies and everything. So we need to have all the equipment with us that we need for the day for surveying and treatment. We found that having two backpacks helped. One is for all the survey equipment and data collection, and then the other bag is for if any herbicide application is to be done, we use a dry bag for that, just to prevent that stuff from getting into the watershed. And within the survey bag is a checklist of everything that you need in that bag, because once you leave the truck, you're done from it. It's hard to get back to it during the day if you've forgotten something. So then getting out to what is a fairly remote watershed, there's a lot of driving involved to get up there. There's a whole lot of bushwhacking. It turns out, going back old school, before we had roads and interstates, the rivers were the main route of transportation, for millennia, and that is generally still the case. The rafts work great in some of the upper watershed where there's a little bit of white water. The water is fairly shallow. You can't necessarily navigate a boat with an engine or a motor through it. So the rafts are great. You just got to be careful because they don't go upstream at all. You have to be very cognizant of where you're trying to get to, because if you overshoot it, then you're past it for the day. Skagit County has been very cooperative and helpful, and they have a jet boat that they have taken us out to some knotweed sites on, and that's super helpful. But again, a lot of it is, the old school method of just getting out there, getting dirty, getting wet, and getting to the site and doing it. Once you're on site, the method generally is if forming a survey line, and you just start walking transects through the floodplain at whatever spacing the conditions sort of call for. If it's a pretty wide open gravel bar, that transect line can be hundreds of feet wide. If you're going through some super dense willows along a gravel bar, you may only be like 10 to 15 feet away from someone. And what you're doing is trying to walk in a line, looking for blue and white flagging or for knotweed itself. The blue and white flagging means, knotweed has been there in the past, and the knotweed itself means there's knotweed that needs to be treated, obviously. At this point, when a patch of knotweed is encountered, the data collection begins, and each patch is given a unique identifier so that it can be found in the past. And then a bunch of metrics are taken on it, like the stem count and the area. A a location, GPS point. We also hang that blue and white stripe flagging, as you can see in this picture, and take a photo of that patch. And then record any sort of herbicide data that was used. That gets us to last year. And again, I'm very appreciative to the Skagit CWMA. They've been a great organization. Everyone in there is very active and helpful, and I appreciate a ton how involved they are. As you can see from this sort of map of the Upper Skagit watershed, SFEG got funding to do treatments in the areas outlined in pink on the right side here, on the right side here. And then the talks about that was able to do knotweed treatment on this lower section of Sauk and this middle section of the Skagit, which meant that since the whole watershed was covered, then Skagit Fisheries could pick up and do this little section down here, which is where the large knotweed infestation is in the middle Skagit. And we were able to able to get funds to do that treatment because other CWMA partners had committed to doing the rest of the watershed. So the whole watershed was covered, and we weren't doing treatments downstream of where nothing had been done, which is great. Not going to get too much into the details of year by year, but this past year in 2023, we were able to survey and treat knotweed along 34 miles of Skagit River and tributaries, and we traversed roughly 4,600 acres, looking for a knotweed within the watershed. Over the course of the program, like I said, we have been very fortunate that we have been able to continually fund it with grants that are available. The Washington State Department of Ag has been a huge resource. I appreciate them a ton. They get money with every state biannual budget that is specifically dedicated to knotweed control that they then distribute to various organizations throughout the state. That's a huge help because number one, it's non-federal funds, and number two, they don't require a match, which means those WSDA funds can be leveraged as match to so many other agencies, and it's a necessary resource to provide. That's absolutely wonderful. So in the past, we've gotten grants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their partners with the Fish and Wildlife Program. The National Forest Foundation was one that we got 2 years ago through their matching awards program, which is a great resource for if you can meet half the match requirements. It's a great resource to do work on Forest Service lands. The Resource Advisory Committee of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest has been funding the program for years. It's wonderful that they're involved. I appreciate their dedication to working with the CWMA and to doing work within the Skagit watershed, both mostly on Forest Service lands, but because there is the wild and scenic corridor along much of the Skagit and various tributaries, that's also a huge resource. And then the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has been a go-to source for a number of years for funding through their Pulling Together initiative, their 5-star and urban waters restoration program, and most recently the America the Beautiful Challenge. And then before I started EcoTrust, it sounds like funded the program very early on and allowed us to build the foundation from which a lot of this program is built now. The short-term outlook is bright. We have sufficient funding through 2025, both from the Washington State Department of Ag and the America the Beautiful Challenge. When that expires, we'll be back to where we always are, which is scrambling to try to find funding to do weed treatments in an area where we have done weed treatments for years in the past. It's sort of one of the ironies of it all is that knotweed treatments in particular require much follow-up, but a lot of agencies are hesitant to, sometimes justifiably hesitant to provide funding to do weed treatments year after year on the same plot of land over and over in the same geographic area. We're also sort of struggling with the when do you expand downstream again? It's I, I feel like we made the right choice when we expanded those 10 miles downstream, but the overall goal of the project is to, you know, keep expanding the program downstream, working in that top-down approach. Right now we don't have the resources to commit to expanding downstream, but when is that going to happen? And do you just commit to it and then struggle to find the resources? So that's one thing that we sort of always struggle with, because we could move downstream, but that would probably, at this point, that would be at the expense of the upper watershed, and then that would fly in the face of the of that top-down approach, and you end up sort of chasing your tail. The very long term, biological controls are on the horizon. I can't speak to a whole lot about that. I know Jennifer Andreas from Washington, WSU Extension, I believe, is going to present at the next Skagit CWMA meeting, which is on January 30th. So those of you interested, maybe want to think about attending that. And drone technologies have come so far so fast. There's presumably ways to integrate that into knotweed control. I have not looked at that much. Like I said, I'm kind of a Luddite. I think the opportunity there is there's a potential huge upside there. I don't know what that is. I'm looking forward to Daniel Zimmerman's talk on that to see what kind of capabilities are out there presently and where it could go in the future. That is all I have. I feel like I've talked a fair bit. I'm sure there will be many questions. I will do my best to answer as many of them as I can. Thank you for sharing your experiences. The data you collect for knotweed surveys specific to the grant you received, stem counts sound pretty time consuming. Yes and yes. We keep a running database of all the knotweed data that we have sort of in one large cumbersome GIS shapefile. Again, not super technical. I do my best to try to get useful information from that, but a lot of times we report what we're required to for the granting agency during that specific timeline, but we keep all that data going past. And stem counts they're time consuming. I agree, but it's one of the few metrics that I feel like is helpful. It's also, probably not as scientific as it could be, because if it's anything over probably 25, it starts to become an estimate, because we're going to take the time to count out like 7,482 stems. But I do feel like it is still it is a metric that can be used to show progress. If your program had access to increase in regular funding, how would you adapt? That's a great question. I feel like we would either expand downstream or continue to do more intense surveys in the areas in which we are doing them. I think, we use a WCC crew seasonally. I mean, to do this, if we were kind of pie in the sky funding, we could probably bring on another WCC crew or hire seasonal folks that were willing to commit to a life outside in the summer. And that would just allow that much more coverage within the watershed. Great to see this approach and results. In 2023, what was the SFEG level of effort in terms of number of days and number of people? In 2023, we were able to do 41 days in the field with a Washington Conservation Corps crew of 5 and their supervisor. And that, I feel like that is about the extent of what you can do for a field season. If you start too early in the season, you can do surveys, but the herbicide treatments are not super effective. The later you can get in the season, the more effective the herbicide is. But also you run into that time constraint of not being able to cover enough ground. So, for 41 days is about the max that I would recommend. Unfortunately, the way to sort of increase this capacity would be to have more than one crew out doing surveys and treatments, but then you run in, then it just starts to cascade and snowball. And you have to be able to have all the supplies and equipment for a second crew and the coordination of that crew. So it's doable. But at this point, we're not ready to move that way yet. What app program do you use to collect field data, and is it done on a phone, tablet, GPS? So we used to collect it on a handheld. We used to collect a lot of the data, GPS points, on a handheld Garmin unit and write all the data down in notebooks. Now that we're trying to go digital, we use a couple of mini iPads, and on there we have field maps for a lot of the mapping stuff and iForm for the database management, field collection of the data. How might changes in Cial-Salite Dam operations affect Skagit River exotic weeds? Oh, I don't know that I want to wade into that morass. I will let, I think, the policy people deal with that one a little more than me. I am a on the ground field guy who deals with the problems in front of him and the weeds that he can see. That policy level stuff is for people much smarter than I, for sure. Can you briefly describe your current knotweed treatment BMPs in regards to herbicides, cut spray versus inject, new patches versus follow-up treatments? We generally do a foliar application using, in the Upper Skagit, it's gotten to the point where we can use like a 50-ounce handheld sprayer much of the time. In that middle section where we've only been doing treatment for a couple of years, we bring out the backpack sprayers. Our preferred method is foliar application. We prefer to do a 1% imazapyr mixture in that. It gets a little complicated because certain landowners have different varying requirements, so sometimes you have to change it up. But following Tim Miller's knotweed kiddie pool studies, he found that mixture was the most effective versus any sort of imazapyr glyphosate mixture. Generally, it's not quite as effective and leaves weed the next year. It can lead to that epinastic growth that everyone seems to see periodically. We have done some injection in the past. Generally, if a landowner is concerned about drift onto something else on their property, we'll do an injection. The only time I've done some cut applications is when a landowner has cut down the knotweed before I get out there, and then I dribble some herbicide into those cut stems. New patches versus follow-up treatments. Generally, it's been my experience, and I know this varies widely, and I'd love to have a larger discussion about this sometime. It seems like rarely is one application of herbicide to a knotweed patch enough to kill it indefinitely. It generally, I feel like, knocks it back roughly 80%, give or take, that first year. And then after that, in follow-up years, you sort of start to see diminishing return. There are some knotweed patches out there that we have been following for years, and every now and then we know it's there and we don't spray it just because there's some evidence out there that holding off for a year or two and then applying herbicide subsequently actually allows it to uptake and may have a more beneficial impact than applying knotweed to the same patch for a decade straight. What herbicide mix are you using for treatment, and how many years do you have to treat the same patch until it's gone? We're planning a similar project to eradicate knotweed from a sub-basin in the Chehalis. Oh man, this is a topic that I think everyone that works in this field has some opinion about. I don't know that I've ever seen actual scientific study on how long it takes to get rid of it, but generally my rule of thumb is plan on 3 years, and it might go slightly longer. And then every now and then you find that patch that you walk past, you don't see it 1 year after you had treated it for 2, and then the next year it pops up and is present again. Hey, Ben, great talk. I'm interested to hear if your team have considered using eDNA data in your knotweed surveys. I don't know the answer to that because I don't really understand what the question is asking, I think. I apparently lack the scientific background to know how eDNA would be helpful for knotweed surveys, but I would love, Arthur, I would love to get in touch with you sometime after this conference and find out what that is all about for sure. What is your process for orientation in the field to find previously identified knotweed stands in the case of dynamic riparian conditions? A lot of times, if you've been doing it long enough, you sort of become familiar with the site or become familiar with the watershed. And it's kind of shocking how much of the stuff actually sticks in your brain when you go out there and you can be like, I know there was a patch here last year. It's not here anymore. It washed away. But we also have, like I said, those mini iPads that have the GPS coordinates of those patches on them. We have the little handheld Garmin's, which have those patches on them. So if you're trying to navigate to a specific location and it says it's 150 feet directly in front of you and you run into the river, well, that seems like a pretty good indication that the river has changed course. That patch has potentially washed away. What does date show about effectiveness of treatments? I don't know. We're still struggling with the best way to sort of coalesce that data and show the long-term benefits of it. What we do with it in the short term is report to the granting agencies that we get funds from, and we can, for example, we can be like, we treated this many knotweed stems or this many knotweed patches, and year to year we've seen an 80% eradication rate. So that's what we use the data for. We have this huge database. I don't have the scientific background to sort of do any sort of analysis with it, but it seems like there is opportunity for someone that's comfortable or familiar with R potentially, or some other kind of data analysis software to do something with it and maybe create some sort of predictive model.